Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm excited for the conversation. We will be interactive, so feel free to jump in on the chat at any point. We are recording this to then share out afterwards, but let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Let's get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go first. My name is Erryca Robicheaux. I am the founder of the San Antonio DEI Practitioners Group. So welcome everyone to our very first training that we're going to put on through the group. I am joined by Javier, who will introduce himself in a little bit. I did want to point out very quickly for those of you who are already in our LinkedIn group, you might have already seen this. If you're not already in our LinkedIn group, please join it. I'll at some point tonight throw that link in the chat so that you can join. We do have a new structure. This structure was based off of the surveys that some of you completed earlier this year. So first, thank you to everybody who completed those surveys, and also shout out to UXSA for doing those surveys for us. They're a super great nonprofit here in San Antonio, and they really put a ton of time and work and effort into not only creating the survey, hosting it, but also doing the data interpretation at the end. So thank you so much to UXSA for that. But our new structure is going to look like monthly virtual programming, probably mostly trainings, because that's what you've indicated to us that you want. And we're also going to supplement that with quarterly in-person meetups, because we still want to have that in-person option as well. So if you are interested in presenting a topic in the future, please go ahead and let me know that. Would love to have some other super great co-presenters presenting some of these monthly programming. Also, if you are part of another nonprofit in San Antonio who would be interested in jointly co-hosting some of those in-person events, also would love to talk to you about that. So you can hit me up in the chat or on LinkedIn. I'll throw my LinkedIn link in there in the chat in a little while as well. So personal intro, my name is Erryca Robicheaux. My pronouns are she, her. I am a DEI consultant and speaker. My probably primary focus is neurodiversity, also the LGBTQ plus community. Still a tongue twister, no matter how many times you say it. I have a master's degree in human factors and information design, and spent a number of years in user experience, really focusing on internal systems and processes and inclusive design. So kind of naturally just made my way from that into the DEI space, and I now use that experience in mixed method research and data evaluation, as well as inclusive design, put it all together, and I use that to assess and create equitable systems within organizations. So enough about me. Super excited to also have Javier joining me today as my co-presenter, so I'll let him take the stage.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I appreciate you, Erryca, for bringing me into this space, for inviting me to lead our inaugural, the first ever virtual training for the San Antonio DEI group. I want to mention that even though this is for the San Antonio DEI group, I love that we have people from around the country joining us today. That's really excited. So thank you all so much. My name, again, Javier Carmona, pronouns he and him. I am currently a program manager at Tinuiti, which is a marketing firm. We are nationwide, remote first. And my experience comes from getting my master's in diversity and equity in education from the University of Illinois. It was online, so don't ask me anything about Illinois. I know nothing. But I do know the education they gave me provided me with the opportunities to grow and develop DEI programs. I was at the university level for almost 10 years. and made the big jump into the corporate sector just a year ago. So I'm new to the corporate world. So be nice to me a little bit. If I need some niceness, please be there for me. But I'm just really excited. This is such a timely conversation. It was not planned to be. This was not planned after the Israel-Palestine conflict. We had planned this already, and when that conflict happened and we started to really prepare for this, I felt it was going to be so important because I don't know about you all, but it's a little bit conflicting. People want you to choose sides. It's hard to have conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can have these difficult conversations. And that's why we're here today. So thank you all so much for joining us. If you are able to, I would love to see faces, but I know not everybody's in a place where they can. Everybody's probably eating dinner, getting ready for the evening. So if you can, join us with your camera on. If not, we totally understand. But let's get things going. Pass it over to Erryca.
So we just wanted to share a little bit about what we're covering tonight, so we're all on the same page. We are going to have a little bit of information that we're going to be presenting. We're going to do a little bit of breakout rooms, so you're going to be able to practice and kind of talk together about what you've learned. 90 minutes is kind of a long time, so don't worry, we threw a break in there for you, but this is just a little taste of what we're going to be covering tonight. But we are going to start with a poem, so I will let Javi take it from here.
Awesome. So this is a poem that I received and got from the Center for the Healing of Racism in Houston, Texas. So if you've heard it before, I know that it's also on the internet. The resource I found was that it's anonymous. We don't really know who wrote it, or I couldn't figure out who wrote it originally. But really, it just goes into play for our conversation today. When I ask you to listen to me and you start to give me advice, you have not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you are trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to do something to solve my problems, you have failed me, as strange as that may seem. Listen. All I ask is that you listen. Not talk, not do, just hear me. And I can do for myself. I'm not hopeless. Maybe discouraged and faltering, but not helpless. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn and I'll listen to you.
Sorry, I have to keep finding the unmute button again. That was beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that. That's actually, I hadn't heard that poem before you introduced it to me a week or two ago. So I hope that everyone appreciated it as much as I did. The next thing we're going to do is talk about community agreements. I'm going to share a set of community agreements with you here for two reasons. First, because as we go into our practice rooms, I want everyone to keep these community agreements in mind. It's what we are going to agree to do tonight for each other. It's also just a great example of a way that you can open up meetings or things like that where you might be having some more difficult conversations. This is a really great way to just level set and get everybody on the same page. So what I'm going to do tonight is just read off a set of community agreements that is based on the Cornell Intergroup Dialogue Project community agreements. There are tons and tons of these out there. So I would encourage you to go and read through some, find what speaks to you, throw away the rest, and yeah, so I'll just go ahead and read them out. As I'm reading them, I would love for you to use the chat for two things. If you hear one that really resonates with you and you feel like it's great and you just really want to hold on to that one community agreement, put that in the chat. Also, if you see maybe one that's missing or you think of one that you would like to add to this that you don't see on here, also throw that in the chat. So tonight, we agree to Practice active and empathetic listening. Challenge the idea and not the person. Be both teachers and learners. Take space and make space for others. Stories stay, but we're going to take those lessons with us when we leave. Use I statements, not you statements. We're going to have one microphone, so one person is going to have the floor at a time. And be here now in the present. I know that it's really easy to get distracted, especially now you probably have partners or kids or animals running around and it's a weird time, but let's try to focus on being here now. Yeah. We will also challenge ourselves to embrace discomfort, because the idea is that we're learning to have hard conversations. And we know that sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. We're going to trust intent of others. And if we do decide to call them in, we're going to name that impact that we are personally feeling because of the things that they've said. We're going to be honest with ourselves and others. We're going to acknowledge judgments and assumptions, including and probably most especially our own. And finally, we're going to accept that things may remain unresolved. When you're having hard conversations, you might not necessarily feel a sense of closure at the end of the conversation, but that's okay because we can continue to have these hard conversations.
Absolutely. And Erryca, while you were chatting, I was watching the chat. And I think all of this is so important. It's a really good foundation. Like you said, we're getting ready to have what could be a very difficult conversation. But Nikki would like to suggest adding own your impact, which is something that you put in there a little bit. That's very true. And then Nissy, I hope I'm saying that right, suggested 1, 2, 3 me. Nissy, I don't know this one. Would you like to come off mute and share with us?
Sure. So sometimes we like to overshare just because we're excited. And if you are an oversharer, self-proclaimed, then sometimes you have to say, I'm going to let 1, 2, 3 people go before I speak again to make sure that I can share the stage.
Wow. I love
that so much.
I love that so much. Oh my
That's
gosh.
amazing.
I think I'm gonna borrow that, Nixie, for every time I go into this. Well, we've set the groundwork. We have now set the standards for what we're gonna have in the conversation tonight, but I want you all now to join me on a little activity. So I'm gonna stop my video, and you are welcome to do so as well. I want you to put yourself in a place where you are able to visualize the conversation I'm about to share with you. So take some time, get yourself in a good space. All right. So I want you to now focus and visualize that you're walking into your local grocery store. As you're walking, you see a few things in particular. It's a Saturday, so you see someone across the store in a shirt with a sports team that you like. Oh, you know what? There's someone you can see wearing a shirt from that other team. You don't really care for that other team, but you know what? Let's continue. As you continue to walk, you start to hear a child screaming and crying because they want their favorite cereal. I personally hope it's Frosted Flakes. There are 2 parents with this child, and they're working to try and get the child to stop crying. Man, that poor child and their parents. Now go ahead and start making your way over to the frozen food aisle. Once you're there, you notice an individual is struggling to get something off of the top row. You offer to help, grab what they need, grab what you need, and then you head over to the checkout line. Wow, this person checking me out is really fast, thank goodness. Now, as you're leaving the store, there are some kids from a basketball team selling some baked goods. You stop, purchase a few things, And then you head back to your vehicle to leave the store. I want everybody to come back on camera if you can. Let's talk a little bit about what this was. Let's rejoin the group. So one of the things I love about this activity is it really gets us to start thinking about the biases we have and how they creep into our lives without us even realizing it. So I'm gonna ask y'all some questions, which you can feel free to drop in the chat. I wanna know, when you saw the sports team on the other person's shirt that you enjoyed, what did you see? What team was it? Patriots, no team. Astros, good season, good time for that. And now you saw someone with the other team introvert, yes. Yes, all for that. You saw someone from the other team, which in this case, team extrovert. So these types of things start to show up in our lives without us even thinking about it. The Raiders. Did you feel a certain way when I mentioned that I hope the Frosted Flakes was the child's favorite cereal? Did anybody feel a certain way? Any reactions? Nostalgia. Saw, yes. And now I never heard of that as a favorite. That cannot be, well, it is my favorite, so. So, but now we think about the child that was crying. We obviously had some feelings about whether Frosted Flakes should have been the favorite. What was the age and the gender expression of the parents that were with that child? And was the child of the same race and ethnic category? When you thought about the person struggling, mine was not, yeah. Didn't picture parents. All right, let's keep going. Now, when you saw the person struggling to get something off the top shelf, what did they look like? What was their age? What was their gender? Were they wheelchair users? Short, elderly, older, female? And then going from that, when you were going through the checkout line and the person was fast, what did they look like? Teenager? Anybody else get a chance to visualize? Oops, Nikki, I went too fast. I talk fast, I'm sorry. Adriana says middle-aged and efficient clerk. Middle-aged femme. I think y'all are seeing the point of how our biases can come into play here, when you can understand me, apparently, because I do talk fast. And now the last question, when you saw the kids from the basketball team, what did they look like? Small. High school male, very specific, Eddie. Cute, mixed race, enthusiastic, middle school, lots of energy. Wow. So yeah, so it's very easy and very quick for our biases to show up in our everyday life, even when we're not thinking about it. So with that, I want you all to, anybody want to come off mute? Anybody want to share their experience of what did you feel as we now talk about the biases that you may have realized that maybe you didn't realize as you were doing the visualization. Anybody want to share? I lost the participants. So stop sharing. Anybody want to share? My bias is that people all appear to be able-bodied. A lot of mine were stereotypical. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about how those biases can show up in our conversations, our daily conversations, and how that impacts our conversations with others. Nissy said that they saw their family members. Wow, it's very true. I have biases in terms of political ideology, and I shouldn't. We'll actually talk about that, Adriana, so I'm glad you brought that up. But for now, to keep things moving, let's go ahead and go on to the next portion, which I'll turn it over to Erryca so we can talk about identity, stereotypes, and discrimination.
Thank you. So the first thing that we are going to talk about is identity. And I know this is a topic that I'm sure everyone on this Zoom meeting has heard talked about before. So I just want to cover a few basics as it relates to how our identities actually shape the way that we relate and communicate with others. So in a similar way as we just saw how all of those stereotypes inform that. I don't know about y'all, but for me, I saw a lot of influence of how my own identities shaped what I saw during that activity. So a couple of key points when we're talking about identities, and the very first one that I want to talk about is identities can be both visible and invisible. And this is really important because sometimes those visible identities are put on us, whether that is fair or not. So a really obvious example of that might be skin color. We all have different skin colors, and sometimes people might see my skin color, your skin color, and automatically assign an identity to us, whether that is true or not, whether it's an identity that we identify with or not, right? And then some identities we are going to choose. So an example of that would be, I identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. If you just saw me in a store, maybe that would be visible to you. Maybe it would be obvious. Maybe it wouldn't. Sometimes it'll be a lot more obvious than others. If it's pride and wearing rainbows and a shirt that mentions my identity, maybe that's super visible. If I'm just in a meeting wearing a plain blue button down with the little pearl earrings, maybe it's not as visible, or maybe it's not something that you would assign to me. Another thing about choice when it comes to identity is that we might choose to identify with some common aspects of a particular identity, but not other aspects. So you can think of this as maybe when it comes to religion, right? So maybe you very much identify with certain parts of one religion, but you don't identify with other parts. And a lot of religions actually afford some level of choice when it comes to things like that. So I think the point that is important here is that identity can be very complex and interrelated. So speaking of interrelated, when we think about identity, there are sort of different levels of identities that we might identify with. So the first level is a personal level. This is super easy. It's how you identify as yourself, right? So that might be gender or sexuality or something like that. The second level of identity, or sort of circle, the next circle is interpersonal. So this is going to be our identity as it relates to other people within our lives. So it might be, your identity might be partner, it might be parent, child, sister, things like that. The next level that we might identify with is at the groups level. So these are groups that we choose to associate with. And this could be a personal thing. So for instance, I mentioned religion, so religious organization or maybe a nonprofit that you're involved in. It can also have to do with your work. So it could be an ERG that you're part of in your organization, or maybe you're part of a certain team. So that would be an example of a group identity. And the largest group or our circle is systematic identity. So you can think back to what I was saying about sometimes we choose our identity and sometimes it's forced on us. An example of a systematic identity might be if you identify as a member of a tribal community. And think about that as it relates to the US government and different laws. So that would be systematic identity. So all of these different identities are going to affect not only how we relate to other people, but also how we relate to ourselves and how those different identities relate to each other on all of these different levels. Another important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about that is that the same identity that we hold might affect your relationships with, or that relationship with other identities that you also hold in different ways. So that might be a little bit confusing. What do I mean by that? A personal example of mine would be that a personal identity that I have is I identify as a queer member of the LGBTQ plus community. So that's a personal identity that I hold. And that identity is going to affect my relationship with my identity as a member of the queer community in a much different way than it's going to affect my relationship as a member of the Christian church, which is another type of group or community. So when you start to think about it, it's actually kind of mind-blowing. It's so complex. It's all so interrelated. But I just want you to take just a couple minutes to stop and think about some identities that you hold, whether they're personal, interpersonal, group, or systematic. And if you want to share that in the chat, you can go ahead and share it. It's not necessary. You can just reflect within yourself if you want to. But that's a little bit about, as we're talking about identities, to keep in mind. And Javier is going to go into more detail about how our personal identities then start to affect how we relate to other people.
Yes, and as you're talking, Erryca, Nissy says, I am neurospicy. I love that. I love that. Can we get a shirt with that, please, if it's not already available? And then Nikki said mixed ethnicity. Yes, agree with that. Nikki agreed with the same. Anybody else want to talk a little bit before we move on about their identities or anything that affects their identities? Jennifer says neurodefiant. Jennifer, I've not seen AUDDHD. Would you be so kind to educate us on that? Autistic ADHD.
Oh, did you want me to come off?
There you go.
Yeah, so I'm a late realized autistic ADHDer. I identify with neurodivergent, neurospicy, neurodefiant as an identity, not as a disorder. also ascribe to the social model of disability justice. And I think that's it. But yeah, some people with the 1-2 combo of autistic and ADHD use AUDHD to kind of just shorten the thing. Like I don't know, neurodivergence is kind of like Pokemon, you collect them all. There's a whole bunch of others, but they don't have short letters.
Wow. Thank you, Jennifer. Like we started the meeting when Erryca said we're going to be teachers and learners, and here we are. Learn something new, which I'm really excited to discover more and learn more about as I continue my journey of learning as well. So thanks for sharing with that, Jennifer. Have an autistic immigrant, ND, ADHD, and LGBT. Thank you all so much for sharing. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about going forward is when we think about these identity markers, some of these we'll think about more often than others. Some of them are top of mind. Some of them, as Erryca mentioned, systems remind us of frequently. But there's always a sense of otherness. And we want to talk about how that can affect your communication. Now, more likely than not, you may be having a difficult conversation or disagreement with someone because of a difference in understanding or expectation. Now, where do these understandings and expectations come from? We learn them, and it starts at a very young age. I mean, think about it. Before you are born, you are assigned male or female, you have blue or you have pink on. So even before you are born, the system has already given you some labels. And we start to learn these at a very young age, and it starts to become an idea where our brain is now filtering things into categories automatically. Now, this is the part where conscious and unconscious bias can begin. And now I want you to think back to that activity and how easy it was for those biases to show up that maybe you never even thought of until we did that activity. Now, the thing with that is that bias can lead to stereotypes, which can lead to prejudice, which can then lead to discrimination. And when we are categorizing someone from an identity marker, we're essentially placing them in a box based on our perception. Have any of you ever heard of perception is reality? Let me hear in the chat. Has anybody ever heard of perception is reality? Yes. Now, I watched a TikTok that a coworker sent me this week, and it talked about perception versus perspective, and it really hit home. I used to believe perception is reality, like that's what the saying was when we were growing up, and that's what I've always known. But we all have our own perceptions and our own unique views. So many times when we get into conversations, we're trying to change people, and that's not the end goal. We're trying to have them see our perception. That's not the goal. The goal is to discuss these differences and not to change the other person's view. The goal should be to learn and to grow and to see the other person's perspective, even if it negates your perception. Now, it is important that you have to remove yourself from this view to try and understand the other person's perspective. So by working to observe the world from the outside view, you can begin to understand their perspective and their experience. So here's a picture of a glass that's either half full or half empty. Let's hear from you all in the chat. What team are you on? What is your perception of this glass? Half full or half empty? Depends on my mood. Another dish to wash. How motivated I am or how overwhelmed. Yeah. So your mood, your surroundings, your environment, all of this is going to change how you perceive things. Nissy says half full. Every day we are encountering things. If you are a DEI practitioner, or if you are even in an ERG or doing anything DEI, so much of our work is based off of this perception and perspective. Now, for those of us who are looking at this half full or half empty, you may not be at a point where you can see the other perspective, someone else's perspective. Like Jennifer, I may not see it as another dish to wash because maybe there's a dishwasher. I don't have to worry about that. But at least we're going to start to ask ourselves, what is it that that other person is experiencing? Why are they saying things from their perception? What does that mean? Now, the biggest takeaway I can give you is that you are never going to be able to change someone's perception because you will never have their perspective. So when you're having these difficult conversations, I want you to really remember this. You will never be able to change someone's perception because you will never have their perspective. Now, this is really when it comes into play that we practice what has been coined the platinum rule. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the golden rule, which is to treat others how you want to be treated. Well, the platinum rule takes it that step further. It asks you to treat others how they want to be treated. So what do you do when you encounter a situation where you're facing someone who has a different opinion? Like Adriana said earlier, when someone has a different political opinion, what do you do? How do you move from trying to communicate your perception to really understand the other person's perspective? Riley mentions, my favorite quote is, perception is subjective. Yes, absolutely yes. That is the whole message for this part of the presentation, is that no matter where you're at, no matter where you are politically, what side of the spectrum you're on, bringing to light the current Israel and Gaza situation, no matter where you are, everybody's perception is so different. And so when we're having these conversations, really thinking about how do we communicate in these difficult times. Now, I know we've been talking a lot. We want to give y'all a quick break. Jennifer says, I cannot disagree or not believe in one person's lived experience. Absolutely, that is their lived experience. That is their perspective on things. But does anybody, before we go on break, does anybody want to share anything? I know we've had some chat going on in the chat, but anybody else want to come off mute and share their understanding or experience of perception versus perspective? All right, we'll give everybody a quick break. While we're doing that, feel free to go to the restroom, grab some water. We're gonna play a song for you all, and then we'll get started with how do you have these conversations? What do you do? The big lesson part of this conversation will be coming up right next.
Yeah, I saw a couple things pop up in the chat, so just wanted to highlight those. Nikki says, I've never heard of perception versus perspective piece before, and it's very interesting. So thank you for sharing that with us. And Jennifer says, I can't disagree or not believe with a person's lived experience. So that's a great point. I also just want to say that in our little timeline that we created for this meeting, we said the break was going to be between 7:15 and 7:20, and we are crushing it. So we are going to play a song that you can listen to. If you need to run to the restroom, grab water, whatever, feel free to do that. If you want to just stay and chill and listen to the song, you can also do that. I did promise that I was going to put in the chat the San Antonio DEI practitioners group, so I'll put that link in there, as well as my own LinkedIn in case anybody has ideas for future meetings.
Awesome.
Why you gotta interrupt when I'm not done talking? I need you to keep it shut. This ain't up for discussion. Yeah, I'm pouring my heart, 'cause I want you to see it. I know you're picking me apart, but you ain't gotta speak it. Why don't you listen? Why won't you listen? Why don't you listen? Yeah, I know you wanna help, but you're deaf to the mission. Even when you see the hand I'm dealt, you pretend it's my decision. Don't try and say that our struggle's the same. Don't lie and tell me you're ready for change. Why don't you listen? Why won't you listen? Why don't you listen? Why won't you listen? I'm standing right in front of you, trying to tell you my truth. The only thing I ask of you is listen. 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 Why don't you listen? Why won't you listen? Why don't you listen? Why don't you listen?
Oh, all right. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I'll give everybody maybe 20 more seconds or so to trickle back in here. Get super excited. Javi mentioned that we were going to talk about, okay, so now we have all of this information. How can you go about approaching these difficult conversations? I saw there's a lot of neurodiversity in this group, which is great. I'm going to have to start using that acronym AUHD or AUDHD. I also identify as such. I think that a lot of you who also identify as neurodiverse individuals might relate to sometimes having conversations are a little bit extra difficult. And that was always super discouraging to me until I realized that having effective conversations is actually a skill that you can learn, you can practice. And what's great is that the LARA method is not the only way to approach this. It's one way that I have personally found to be highly effective. There are tons of other ways. So do a little bit of research, find the one that works for you, and then practice, practice, practice. that skill until you become a better communicator. I hope that you, like me, find a lot of value in the LARA method that we're going to be talking about tonight. The LARA method is a community guide, or I'm sorry, a communication guideline. It was developed by Bonnie Tinker, who was actually a Quaker leader who noticed the need to actually teach others how to engage in difficult and emotional conversations. So we started tonight out by talking about some of the things that are going on in the world. It's obviously not just the Israeli conflict, but there are tons and tons of other things going on in the world right now that are hard. So this is a great method that was created specifically for difficult and emotional conversations. It was created in the early 90s, which wasn't that long ago, but you'll find that it has become a staple in the field of effective communication. So what does LARA stand for? It is an acronym for listen, affirm, respond, and add. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of these, give you some examples of what they mean, and then we're going to jump right into a breakout room and practice these. So our first L for listen, this is probably the thing that we have all tried to practice. We've heard active listening, but the key to this step is you don't have to do anything. Don't be active. Your whole job is to sit there or stand there and listen to learn, not to respond, not to change. You are listening to learn all you can about that thing that the other person is saying. So this requires you to pay attention. If you're like me, when I am practicing active listening, I'm actually thinking about the thing that I'm going to say back to them. That's not what we're trying to do here, right? We are listening to learn, and not just to learn and to hear, but to actually try to understand what the other person is saying. Now, this doesn't mean you have to understand their perspective or their perception, like we were just talking about, but you have to listen to try to understand the thing that they are trying to communicate to you before you're going to be able to respond. The second step is affirm. So the key here is to affirm not just what the speaker is saying, but what they're feeling, and if you share any of those feelings or those values. So again, different from active listening, it's not just saying what I hear you saying. What it's saying is what I hear you're feeling, right? So you can, an example of this might be, it sounds like this incident made you feel angry or made you feel scared. So it's not just hearing the words, but also trying to reflect that you are hearing what the other person is feeling. The third step in the LARA method is respond. So you are responding directly to the concerns or questions that the speaker has raised. Now, this might actually be the hardest step in all of these to do effectively, because this is our chance to express our own feelings. And our feelings might be strong, they might be emotional, they might be pointed, but to do this step effectively, you can't just express your feelings, you have to do it in a way that's productive to the conversation. So a really good tip when you're thinking about responding is remember that community agreement that we said we're going to use I statements, not you statements. So you're not going to say, oh, because you said that, I know that you're a sexist. A good way to respond to that would be to say, when you say that women are inferior, I feel angry. That makes it about you and your own feelings, but you are not labeling the other person. The final step is to ask and add. So this is your chance to ask any additional open-ended questions that might help you to have a better understanding of what this person is trying to communicate to you and to gather additional details and information. So this might actually look like circling back to the first 3 steps, right? Listen, affirm, respond as you are collecting more and more information until you finally get to a place where you actually understand where the other person is coming from and what they're trying to say. And then after you do all of that, then you're finally going to add. Now, the key here is that when you're adding, you're not trying to solve anything or come to a resolution or change the other person's mind, right? So we can think back to that community agreement that says we have to accept that things may remain unresolved. What you're really trying to do for this step is add additional perspective, additional considerations, maybe something different that this person hasn't thought about before. But we're ultimately trying to relate it back to, we have to understand the problem, we have to understand their feelings, and then we're going to add additional context. So the reality is that we could do an entire class on the LARA method. So 10 minutes was not, probably didn't do it justice, but there's sort of a brief overview of the LARA method and the different steps. I am gonna put these steps in the chat so that you can keep them in mind as we practice. So the next thing that we are going to do is we are actually going to practice some of these steps.
Real quick, Erryca, there was a conversation in the chat that I think we could have before we jump into the breakout rooms. The question is, what if they don't explicitly say women are inferior, but allude or imply it? Now, Jennifer has maybe suggested, there was a question mark as the end, but maybe suggest saying, when you ignore me, my ideas, women, and talk about that behavior that triggered the anger. What are your thoughts, Erryca?
Yeah, that's a super great question. So what if they don't explicitly say something? You, in that particular situation, I think the way that I would approach it would be to say, I heard you say this one thing. And when you said that one thing, it made me feel this particular way. Now, it may make sense to explain further and say it made me feel this particular way because it felt to me like you were insinuating this other thing. Or you may just leave it there. You may just say, I heard you say this, and this is how that thing that you said made me feel. So that's how I would approach that. I know that that's sort of a broad way to approach it, but since it's hypothetical, I'm like,
that makes sense. That was my comment because, you know, rarely will somebody say, well, Black people are just more criminal. They'll say stuff like, well, you know, that neighborhood is really not that safe. And it's like, okay, well, I can't say when you said that neighbor, you know, I could say when you say that neighborhood's not that safe, it makes me feel like you're talking about that neighborhood is not safe because there's Black people there. So maybe that's kind of the way to do it. But oftentimes you can't just, they don't come out straight out and say like women are inferior or gay people are weird, or they don't say that. They say something else, and it's really hard to not say you said this. So
Yeah.
it's I guess saying like, when you said this, it made me feel like you meant this.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you know, we're in Texas. I grew up in Louisiana. I think that was a really great example because I did experience a lot of that type of sort of coded language a lot. This would be a great opportunity for you to say, can you explain more? Can you tell me what you mean by that? Can you tell me what makes you say that? Give them the opportunity to explain. And this is the opportunity for you to gather more information.
I love this. This is great conversation. Thank you for bringing that up, and thanks for everybody chiming in. We're already holding class and we're already learning, and we're not even in the breakout rooms. How amazing is this? So while Erryca's setting up the breakout rooms, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in practice. So those of you that aren't on camera, please know that we will ask you hopefully to come off mute if you can. I know that some people are on their phones and it makes it difficult, but do what you can to participate in the conversation. But we are going to have some breakout rooms, and this is a scenario that we want you to discuss. Your company recently advertised an opportunity for an internal promotion. A number of qualified candidates applied, and 2 final applicants were Stacy and Bob. Now, Stacy is a single Black individual in their mid-30s. Bob is white, married with children, and in his early 50s. You go to lunch with your coworker, Greg, and Greg tells you that he is very upset about the final decision. He goes to church with Bob, and their kids attend the same school, and he is positive that Bob was the better candidate, and thinks that therefore Stacy must have simply been a diversity hire.
And just like that, time flies when you are having fun.
Absolutely.
I think everybody is back, so let's dive right on in. Hope you all had great conversation. We'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 people to share in just a minute. We wanted to go over sort of some things that some ways that we might respond. So for those of you who've already read it, I'm just going to kind of go over it again. For Affirm, I hear that you have great respect for Bob and you feel like he would have been a great choice for the position. So you must be feeling really sad for your friend because of this missed opportunity for him. That's a great way to show that you not only heard what he said, but you understand how he must be feeling. Respond might be when you state that Stacy was not the most qualified candidate and must be a diversity hire without having evidence to support it. As a woman, that makes me feel defensive. So that kind of touches on what we were talking about earlier. That kind of, you didn't quite say it, but you kind of did say it. And then finally ask and add some questions that you could ask. Have you asked Stacy about her application and qualifications? Or are your statements based on assumption? You can just ask that. And a great ad might be, perhaps we can ask the selection committee to be more transparent about their process and why Stacy was chosen. So this gives the opportunity not only for Greg to know, but also, hey, if Greg's having these feelings, maybe everybody does. So maybe this is an opportunity to sort of attack this from a systematic level instead of a personal level. So it brings, or an interpersonal level. So it brings it from one of those inner circles all the way out to that big circle.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm going to start from the bottom because it's just top of mind listening to you is like, is there a systemic problem? Are people having these ideas because it's a bigger problem? There's a bigger issue that maybe they're seeing. But I think too, also just starting back when we listen to this individual, and we're really like I love that Erryca said, mentioning like, oh, you have such great respect for Bob. And I think that's really important to personalize, to make sure you're not brushing past the relationship that they have, and to make sure that you are creating kind of like that safe space to have the conversation. You're not just like, oh yeah, whatever, it is what it is. You're creating that space to have a much deeper conversation. And then I think too, when you respond, just making sure that it's not coming from an emotional place. You would never want to say, well, Bob, I can't believe you feel that way. You definitely want to make sure you're responding with some sympathy, some understanding, so that they feel that they're in this space where it's comfortable to have the conversation and they're not just going to be shut off.
And this is why we practice this, right? Like, this is why we practice these hard things now before they come up. Obviously, if you're talking to the CEO of your company, you might say things in a much different way than you would to your, bestie at work, right? If you don't feel like what you're going to say is going to be received well, then there is a certain amount of discretion that comes with, should I say this? Now, this framework is a great way to say as much as you can in a way that is productive, if that makes sense. Javi, I know you had something to say as well.
Yeah, I think, Nikki, you bring up some really great points because, like you said, the power, the privilege, where you're at, where you're situated, even just where you're located. Like, is it a space where you can have that conversation? So I don't know if any of you have heard of calling in versus calling out. So calling out would be a much more public place. This is, I gotta say what I gotta say. Whereas calling in, like you pointed to, Nikki, would be like hey, are you open to having this conversation? Is this something you would like to talk about? Because I think when we start there, then we can start to listen, and that's where we kick in the like, okay, now let's listen to what they're going to say. So I think that's really important to think about. Obviously, situation. Can I call this person in? And what does that look like? Is it safe? Is it healthy? Because like Missy said, retaliation is very true. It's very honest. It does happen. And I think that's where sometimes as DEI practitioners, it can get hard to have these difficult conversations. But in a sense, as DEI practitioners, in some places, we do have that power and privilege to have these conversations and pull people in to say, hey, you've caused some harm. Let's talk about that. But also to gain a better understanding of where people are coming from in general.
Such beautiful points. I don't think we could end on a better way. It's 8:01, so we took 1 extra minute of your time, but thank you so much for joining for the great conversation, for being part of this first training that we're doing. Thank you to Javier for being my co-leader. I don't think that I could have found a better person to co-facilitate this conversation.
Thank you, Erryca. Thank you all so much for joining us late at night. For some of you, please help answer the poll and we will see y'all around.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.